I'm sitting in the J. Lowenberg Philosophy Library at Wells College at the very end of a wonderfully stimulating day-and-a-half visit to this campus. I've never been to this campus before, or even to this specific area of New York. So coming into a rural environment and finding this collection of lively, engaged students and faculty has been a real treat. In the last day and a half, I have given 4 lectures, 3 of them in courses, in an introduction to politics course, in a body politics course, and an introduction to anthropology course. And in addition to that, I've given a public lecture called Robust Cultural Pluralism in the New World Order, 3 Prophecies. Since I was staying in the Prophet's Chamber, the quarters in which visitors stay here, it seemed really appropriate to give such a talk. So I slept in the Prophet's Chamber, and the next day I was delivering prophecies. Of course, these were reports on other people's prophecies. The public lecture was about the New World Order and different people's predictions about what's going to happen in the coming decades. And I described a prophecy which was the Washington Consensus during the 1990s and still is a very popular view that essentially the West is best and is going to spread throughout the world, that there is a unilineal development in history, an ideal civilization that is being approximated, and the United States, for example, it comes closest to realizing that ideal civilization, and progress will go on in that direction. The second prophecy, quite the contrary, views American society, for example, our liberal democracy, as unique and not something which is transportable or exportable, and believes that it's possible for globalization to go forward while there remains robust cultural diversity at a global level. I discussed various predictions of that sort, including Samuel Huntington's views, which is essentially a view that favors global multiculturalism but domestic monoculturalism, and supports the idea of diverse civilizations, each benefiting from globalization but retaining their own cultural traditions. And I discussed the third prediction, which basically sees the world moving in the direction of something that looks more like a multicultural empire of old, like the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire, with a cosmopolitan elite essentially running the globalization side of things, while various local control is given to local elites who perpetuate thick ethnicity. So I described those 3 prophecies and discussed some of the difficulties with all of them. In the Introduction to Politics course, I gave a lecture called When Cultures Collide, and it was an attempt to think about what happens as peoples migrate from southern sites into first world liberal democracies, bringing with them beliefs and practices that mainstream populations, some of whom view themselves as pluralists, don't like. I described, for example, a bumper sticker one often sees in the United States saying, "Celebrate diversity," and I tried to examine what that was meant to imply, and whether or not the kinds of diversity in cultural practices that anthropologists have been studying for decades could actually all be picked up and transported into a single domestic sphere like in the United States. And the issue there was, what is the scope of tolerance for cultural diversity, and what are the limits on tolerance? What principles ought to guide judgments about whether something is an un-American cultural activity or not? And I posed that question in a subsequent lecture in the body politics course, namely asking students what's on their un-American cultural activities list and why, what principles would govern it, and why would, for example, gay marriage be okay but polygamous marriage not be okay? Why would genital modifications of males be okay but not female genital modifications? And we focused especially on that latter case and viewed a documentary film about initiation in West Africa in which one heard diverse voices, and especially heard the voices of women who were supportive of the ritual initiation and the cosmetic genital surgeries that went on, voices that are not usually heard in discussions of the practice. Finally, I talked about my experiences in Orissa, India over several decades in an Introduction to Anthropology course, focusing on things that I've learned as a guest in that community, especially attending to the way in which people make moral judgments and the way in which people explain illness. And I read transcripts from interviews and healing sessions collected in an Orthodox Hindu temple town, and I tried to describe theoretical frameworks to make sense of that interview material, one of which is called the Big Three of Morality, which tries to describe three different ways of thinking about morality: an ethics of autonomy, an ethics of community, and an ethics of divinity. And I also tried to describe the most common ways people explain illness and suffering on both a worldwide scale and in that community, especially focusing on interpersonal explanations of suffering, where you believe you're sick because of evil eye, ancestral spirit attacks, sorcery, or basically the ill will of neighbors, colleagues, and friends. And I also describe moral explanations of illness, in which the mode of explanation is to trace your suffering to transgressions of the moral order, typically violations of food taboos, of sexual restrictions, and of authority relationships. And then finally, I described biochemical explanations of illness, which are also prevalent on a worldwide scale, and talked about the particular manifestations of those three modes of explanation in India. In addition to the lectures, I've had both entertaining, informative, and lively discussions and debates with faculty at 2 dinners, and I've met with groups of students both for breakfast and for lunch. The entire experience has been intellectually intense in the best sense of the word, and utterly exhilarating. I think that's about all I have to say about the visit so far.